I guess, expanding a little bit more in terms of the work that we've been doing. So this is joint research with AgResearch, and very appreciative of the farm team and the technical team for what they've been doing for the last 5 weeks. So really, the aim of this project was to try and come up with some farmer-friendly visuals linking soil conditions and lying behaviour, because we know that there's a lot of pressure coming on us around the conditions and I guess the welfare conditions of our animals and crop systems. So trying to get some data, some good solid data that can help in terms of when do we need to be actioning our adverse weather plan. How do we know if we're achieving the 8 hours a day? So we've used a number of, or 2 devices. So these devices around the ankle. What we do know is in some places they don't stay on particularly well when the mud gets too deep, and also ear tag devices. So these ones will give us information in terms of lying and standing, and the number of steps that they're doing and how long they're lying for. And then the ones in their ears will tell us their body temperature, but also their eating behaviour. So we'll have all of that. The other thing is the tech team got to go out into the paddock every morning, 4 paddocks every morning, and do gumboot scoring and pugging depths and soil moisture measurements, and they were assessing how much soil there was on the cows, so looking at cow aspects. And then the plan is that once we've got all of the data off the devices, we'll then look at bringing the 2 lots of data together and looking to see what indicators we can take from the soil conditions that will give us an idea of what's happening with lying. And we purposefully have done it over a 5-week period because we wanted to get as wide a range in weather conditions as possible, and I think we've probably achieved that.
Dawn prayed for that storm in early July, everybody, so you can thank her.
Yeah, sorry, I was a bit worried at the start that we were going to have a winter where it was going to be perfect and the cows were going to be on top of the ground the whole time, but yeah, early July solved that for us. And so we've also been taking a lot of photos along the way, and I guess this one at the top here is one of our paddocks down on the lower flats, but yeah, interesting. I think the water trough leaked in the middle of the paddock here, but you can see these really obvious lying bowls within the paddock, so they could be some good indicators of what's happening in terms of lying behaviour. And yeah, just another photo here when I drove in on Monday morning, nice and frosty, and lots of cows lying down in that paddock. So yeah, this, as I said, this is just the devices came off the cows yesterday, so we've got a lot of information that we need to work through. And just, I guess, in context, we had 30 animals within each of 4 mobs, so 120 animals that we've been doing this monitoring on.
So each is 2 cows.
Yeah, so 2 cows and 2 fodder beef herds. So, oops, why are we not going forward, Louise? Oh, there we go. The other project, just talk a little bit about, is the cumulative effects of fodder beet, and so it's really, is there an impact of the fodder beet on the calves from birth right through? So looking at measurements right from when they come into the calf pens right through to the end of their first lactation. So we've only got 1 cohort of animals through that whole period to date, so haven't got can't say a lot yet, but one of the things that we have identified over 2 years is that the calves born to the fodder beet dams have been lighter, shorter, and have a smaller girth. So when we, I guess, when we observe that for 2 years, one of the things that we're delving into a little bit more is if they are smaller in stature, are there any implications in terms of bone health? So we have teamed up with Massey University to be doing some work with them, and as I mentioned, the measurements are ongoing, so we've got our 2018 born calves that are coming into the herd this year, and then 2019 in next year. So we'll be, as the results start coming through, we've got the calf stuff. Hopefully by the end of this year we'll have 2 lots of the first lactation ones through as well, so we'll keep feeding that through. The other thing that we're looking at is because we've got quite big differences in the nitrogen inputs between our standard and our lower impact system, trying to understand those system nitrogen dynamics. So you might see in our notes that we talk about it's N intake week next week. So once a month we do detailed pre and post plating of the paddocks on all of the herds for 1 week, and we take feed samples, and then 4 times a year we link that up with blood, urine, faeces and milk samples, so we can look at the partitioning, what's in the diet, and then how's that being partitioned, and so that'll all lead into the, I guess, pulling that whole nitrogen cycling story together for each of the farmlets, and linking that through with the work that Ross and Chris have been doing in terms of the nitrate leaching. And the last one is some work that we've just really started on. So again, the ag research team at Invermay, so Cecile Decline and Tony Vanderwoerden involved in this work. So trying to understand the greenhouse gas emissions from our systems that we've got here, and we're also linking up with some commercial farms to do it as well. So that's looking at measuring dry matter intake, assessing the feed quality, and calculating the N surplus, and then putting it into I guess an inventory type calculation to look at a little bit more detail in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions from our system. So that's, I guess, a bit of an overview on some of the more detailed work that we're doing. And so just going to hand back to Louise, and she's going to talk about from a high level some of the things that we've learned in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit about some stuff we've learned from the hub perspective, and then Dawn's going to give you some of the key things that we have some real confidence in from the research data. But 3 years on, what do we know? We know we possibly should have been more conservative with our pasture growth and milk production estimates for a new conversion. It might have been sensible. So we haven't grown the grass or made the milk that we thought perhaps we might. But like Charlie said, we grew 1 tonne more this year than last year. Our neighbour, who we're trying to grow as much grass as this year, he grew 2 tonnes less. So we kind of made a 3 tonne gain on the gap between us and the neighbour. So that's, you know, the farm's sort of starting to develop. We've learned that Old South and sheep farms need a lot of recovery, drainage, maintenance, and thistle control, and ragwort control, and dock control. But if anyone's looking for seeds, we're the place to go to. We've learned that research farms are not normal farms. They are complex and they require exceptional people. And like I say, we've got a really neat crew here at the moment with some fabulous traits, and they really spend the day trying to make each other's day easier, which is fantastic. And at the end of it, we can deliver some amazing research data to Dairy NZ and to the techs. And probably the other thing that's real key for me that I've learned is research answers require patience. So it's a bit like a fancy shampoo. If you remember the 1990s Pantene commercials with Rachel Hunter, it won't happen overnight, but it will happen. You know, we're currently in a 3, maybe 4 year farm systems trial. We won't know for sure if things are true trends until we've done those 4 years, until the research gets analysed. So it's kind of hard for farmers. You sort of want the information this year and we're away, but we're doing a 3 or 4 year trial. And so, you know, the concrete evidence is at the end of that period. So yeah, we've got to have a bit of patience with the research outcomes is something I've learned that I've got to keep sharing with farmers. But that's why today we're talking about what we know already, and we can, you know, put hand on heart over. And then Dawn will talk through those.
Yeah. So I guess, as Louise said, especially with farm systems, and we're seeing that already. So we've done 2 years of our current farm systems comparison. Some things we've got some consistency over those 2 years. Other things, one farmlet did well last year and hasn't done so well this year. So I guess some of the things that we have confirmed is that it is harder to put body condition score on cows grazing kale over winter than fodder beet. Some of that's relation to the, I guess, the yield, but also the amount of energy that they can consume. Much easier to get higher energy intakes on fodder beet. However, with the fodder beet, meeting the crude protein requirements in winter on fodder beet is difficult, and especially with R1s that have a higher protein requirement. And this is, I guess, linking it back to the profitability as well. We know we could give them less fodder beet and more supplement, but that impacts on the cost of that system. So if we're trying to, I guess, get the maximum benefit out of being able to grow that fodder beet crop, how can we meet those protein requirements? We also learned early on in year one, year one we didn't do any phosphorus supplementation, so we learned that if you don't supplement with phosphorus, you can drop your blood phosphorus levels pretty quickly. So then we've been looking at, well, what are our options for getting that into them? And it is challenging when we're using baleage out in the paddock, and I guess where we've landed for the last 2 years is actually tackling it in 2 different ways during winter, so a loose lick and also onto the baleage. But now our focus is very much on how can we be making sure that our animals are going into the winter in a good position in terms of their phosphorus levels. We know that from a couple of years ago that these fodder beet systems are more susceptible to poor mineral nutrition management, especially through that springer early lactation period. If you don't get it right, you can have animals fall over pretty quickly, and yeah, definitely we've noticed a difference between the fodder beet and the kale systems. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing differences in the size of the calves. Still delving into that, I guess our initial thoughts were we were thinking it was potentially being driven by phosphorus, but now I guess with the work we've been doing, we think that protein is probably a significant part of that story as well, and because we know that protein is required both for body growth but also for bones as well, so we're continuing with that. In terms of the from a pastures perspective with the forage value index, we've learnt that there have been significant gains in through pasture breeding with the new rowgrass cultivars being far superior in terms of being able to manage the heading of them. Particularly last year we found that the low value, the low index cultivars, we were trying to control heading from about October through to March. So yeah, there's definitely the plant breeders have done a good job in terms of that heading management. Really surprised in the first year where we had the 2 levels of nitrogen input, how much the pasture responded, the pasture clover content responded. So we've got about a 10 percentage unit difference for this year in the clover content between the lower impact farmlets and the standards, and I'll show that data a bit later on. This year, I guess we've with the challenges that we've had with the weather conditions and flooding, we have struggled with our fodder beet yield. We've got a very variable between paddock and within paddock yields. So within a paddock, because we're doing yields on a fortnightly basis, can have anywhere from about 11 tonne to about 19 tonne within the paddock, and it's just depended on some areas used to get flooding, so we know that fodder beet doesn't like wet feet, but we've got to make sure with those fodder beets that we've got good soil preparation, and I think this year we just didn't have the growing degree days with the low sunshine hours to be able to produce the fodder beet yields that we might have expected. So now I'm going to hand over to Ross, and he's just going to go through the key level learnings from the environmental perspective.
Thanks, Dawn. So the nitrogen leaching measurements that we've made, we're sort of mid-flight. We're 2 years through a 3-year program, but so these results or findings are preliminary, but I think there's a consistent pattern that we're seeing, and a mixture of some surprising results and some that we hypothesized. As we thought, those autumn grazed fodder beet plots were pretty leaky for nitrogen, and that's really due to leaving that soil bare for much of the winter. There's no sink for the nitrogen that's left behind to be taken up by a plant. So not surprising, we're measuring large losses there. What did surprise us was that lifting that fodder beet didn't seem to make much of a difference, which surprised me a little bit. Having said that, the grazing pressures in terms of urine returns isn't that large, so I think what it's suggesting is that there's quite a lot of residual soil mineral nitrogen that sticks around and is leached over the following winter months. Perhaps the most important observation from the winter treatments is that it seems as though the leaching losses from the fodder beet are much less than from the kale, and we can talk in more detail about that in following slides. And then finally, the limited measurements we're making on one of the pasture, on the pastures of one of the farmlets are coming back as we expected. So that's giving us a reasonable amount of confidence that Overseer is probably tuned well enough for the SDH soil and climate scenario.
Thanks, Ross. So now for the fun bit. Yep, so what we're going to do now is just take you through in a little bit more detail the farm systems performance summary for the last season. So just a recap of the farm systems for those that may be new to the hub and haven't seen it before. We have our 2 standard systems, so one based on kale and the other based on fodder beet. So these are stocked at 3.1 cows per hectare, get up to 200 units of nitrogen, and the different crops obviously. And then from a supplementary feeding perspective, within our kale system, have access to in-shed feeding. So that's either a PKE or a PKE barley blend, plus any baleage that they make within their system, compared with our fodder beet standard system, where they're wintered on fodder beet and we use fodder beet in the shoulders, either lifted or grazed, plus the supplement they make. So they were our 2, I guess, sort of standard systems based on feedback in terms of what those systems were being run like across the region. We then looked at them and said, right, well, what options have we got to reduce the nitrate leaching of them by 30%? And that's where we came up with our lower impact system. So again, one based on kale and one based on fodder beet. So we set a bold target of, did the modelling, and what it came out was that to reduce our N surplus and our predicted N leaching, we needed to drop our fertiliser nitrogen to 50 units of N per hectare per annum. So they have an application of 20 in spring, and then 15 in December, and then another 15 in autumn. So that's it for the year for them. Consequently, we predicted that we would grow less grass, so they're stocked at 2.6 cows per hectare, and then access to the same feeds as their corresponding standard system. So That's the cap of the system. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Louise, and she's just going to take you through this wagon wheel approach to presenting the data.
Yeah. And I'll just go back 2 clicks of this for those who haven't seen it. People think, oh, well, we must have the farms, you know, like we broke it with the farmlet here and the farmlet here, and you know, they're all down one race, they're not this patchwork quilt. So everyone's got equal walking distance, equal share of soil type, contour, terrain, you name it. So it's fun, and this is what creates Charlie's headaches with a wee support block out the side and a cow shed in the centre. So this wagon wheel approach. So this is the thing, is we're doing farm systems research, and it's really easy to focus on one thing, and we see production every day, and I'll sit here and freak out in my little head about the differences in production and think about bank balance at the end of the day like any normal farmer would. But farm systems research is actually a whole bunch of stuff that's important. And how do you compare profit, milk production, pasture growth, reproduction, herd efficiency, the complexity of the system, and those environmental KPIs all at once? So this is something that's been used in industry to deal with these wicked problems. And the idea is that the black line around the outside is the target. So if a farm system is perfect in all of these areas, it'll be hitting out there. And so what we see as we go around, if we look at milk production, the standard farmlets perform better than the low impact farmlets, and there's a split between them. Your pasture growth per hectare, we've got the standard farmlets growing more than our low impact farmlets. For reproduction, we saw that the calves did better than the fodder beets. For herd efficiency, we saw that the calves did better than the fodder beets. For BCS management and the amount of months we spent having to intervene on herd level BCS because it was a problem, the fodder beets were far easier to manage than the calves. For system complexity, for the amount of time spent managing them and fiddling around and feeding out DCP or feeding out fodder beet or topping paddocks or whatever it might have been, the calves are far more simple to manage than these fodder beet systems. We looked at the amount of the farmlet that's cultivated to indicate, you know, that phosphate loss or that water quality indicator. And, you know, team yellow, the low impact fodder beets, they're actually near the lowest area of their farmlet cultivators. They have a bit of a win. And over here on nitrogen leaching, the target was to reduce by 30% off the standard kale farmlets. Well, the yellows have exceeded that. So they're outside the wheel, they've gone a bit too far. And so when we look at the profit of it, we see a real discrepancy between them. So, you know, we might talk about this stuff, but actually all these things are important. So the big trade-off for the low impact fodder beets here on that profit differential is that we've got some really astounding results here on the environmental front, and we've got to keep that stuff front of mind. So this is a neat way to see it all at once, and you can kind of see how they compare, but Dawn's going to take you through the detail of some of this stuff.
Thanks, Louise. What we'll just do is go through, so I guess some of the key difference. So this is just for last season. So what we observed, measured, is that for the 2019 winter, that the fodder beet cows calved in better body condition score than those wintered on kale. So you can see here, and particularly our later, the later calving ones, because we had fodder beet for them to stay on until the beginning of October, whereas our kale ones were off crop by this second week in August, really. So yeah, definitely differences in the body condition score at the start of the season, came back together, and then you can see through the latter part, or especially through this middle part of the season, and with the standard fodder beet system, because we didn't have access to in-shed feeding. Well, we did have access to it, but it's not part of the farm system, couldn't use it, and we didn't have fodder beet available to graze at that time. So if they were short of feed, it was baleage that was going in, which potentially not as good a quality. So we did have a few more challenges, and then worked really hard in the late lactation with strategic once a day milking, and earlier on, and for the kales and the kale systems in shed feeding to get that body condition score back up leading into the winter period. The next area just looking at was in relation to average pasture cover. And so, like many, last spring we came into spring in ahead in terms of our average pasture cover because of the growth that we achieved through the winter, but it was similar across all of the systems. And through, through the early spring period, we started seeing a few differences. Getting up to, I guess, that late October period, it was wet. We weren't able to get baleage off as timely as we would have liked, so we got to some pretty high covers towards the end of October, but then had some harvest come off. What we saw through the heading period was quite significant differences in average pasture cover, and some of this was driven by our ability to be on the right rotation, just with the number of paddocks and the size of the paddocks. So that, as Louise said, that's something we're looking at addressing for this year, is how can we get better management through this, the heading period, and also hopefully this year the more rapid pasture growth area. So we did take some more baleage out of there to get them back on track. Then what we saw through the latter part of the season was the standard systems running at higher average pasture cover, and what drove this was the differences in the pasture growth. So we had similar pasture growth through the winter and early spring, but started to see some deviation with our lower impact farmlets growing less from basically November on, and then really seeing some differences through the back end of the season. So not getting the same average growth rates through the month, where we had less nitrogen in the system. One of the positives with our lower impact systems is in terms of the clover content. So as I mentioned earlier, significantly more clover in our lower impact system. So they still not as much clover as we would like, but hopefully that will come with more time, and we have seen small increases between the 18-19 and the 19-20 season. So we've got sort of 8 or 9% in our standard systems, and 17-18%. And so this is the clover. We do these botanical compositions through February, March, when we'd expect to have the best clover content, or the clover would have the best opportunity in the system. So picking up some differences there. As said, we're doing a lot of monitoring in terms of pasture quality. For last year, there was no real consistent trends in the pasture quality, and some of this is, we think, because every month we're potentially sampling different paddocks on the farm, because basically we're sampling the next 3 paddocks that are grazed for each of those farmlets. And because we've got such a wide range of cultivars, it could be that some of the month-to-month differences, or the differences between the standard and the low impact, is being driven by, we might actually have the cows grazing 2 of the low forage value cultivars in that period. So we're just working through a strategy so we can actually pick some monitor paddocks this year and follow them through to get a bit of a picture. But I guess in terms of dry matter percentages, so not a lot of noise in there, but I guess low dry matter percentages through the later part of the season. So 15% sort of, if it's below that, then that's when we can run into issues with animals not being able to physically eat enough through the period that they've got available for grazing. So we were sort of around that 13 to 14% through the later part of the season this year. In terms of the ME, I'm not quite sure what happened with the fodder beets in 2 fodder beet systems in February, but we had a couple of paddocks that obviously weren't particularly good quality. But again, you can see quite a lot of variation there. The protein, so starting to see or possibly see some differences. So if we think back to the average pasture cover, the graph that before, through this period here was when our low impact herds were had their highest average pasture cover. So we've seen lower crude protein through there, so it could be average pasture cover that's driving that difference, or it could be the fact that these have had a lot more nitrogen. So our low impact ones have had their one application of 20 units back in end of August, beginning of September, and then whereas the standard systems have been getting 25 units after each grazing. Interestingly, looking through the later part of the season, that trend flips over, and potentially it could be the higher clover content through this period that's driving that higher nitrogen for our low impact system. But interestingly, and we see this consistently when we've looked at, like, so within the Foragers for Reduced Nitrate Leaching program or with our monitor farms, increases in crude protein content of our pastures into that autumn period. And I guess this is the time of the year when we don't really want that increase, because that surplus nitrogen is going to be deposited in the urine, and it's those urine patches that are deposited late in the season that have got the most risk of leaching through the period. So if we were going to have higher nitrogens, it would be better at the front end of the season, not the back end of the season. And then pasture phosphorus, I guess we're tracking this in relation particularly to the fodder beet feeding, and interesting to see that it followed a similar trend to the crude protein towards the late end of the season. This is a real positive in terms of our fodder beet system, because one of the things that we're really keen to do is make sure that our cows are going into winter in the best I guess position they can be in terms of their phosphorus reserves. So this increase in phosphorus late in the season will be of benefit to those animals. Now just going through the milk production trends for the season. So this graph's looking at kilograms of milk solids per cow. So you can see that we had a later and peak production for the kale herds, and some of that was driven by calving spread. So the fodder beets herds had a quicker calving last year, and some potentially being driven by differences in body condition score at calving as well. But what we observed was for our low impact fodder beet that we had a lower peak and also consistently lower production throughout the season on a per cow basis. If we take that through to a per hectare basis, you can see our 2 standard systems. So the standard fodder beets got off to a roaring start with their milk production and their calving, but by the time we hit sort of the end of October, you can see that the standard kales have overtaken them, but they sort of follow a similar line because of our differences in stocking rate, our lower impact system. So there's a drop for standards, but one of the things that is intriguing us at the moment, and something that we are going to try and delve into more, is why we've got this bigger gap in terms of our lower impact kale and fodder beet systems at the same stocking rate. So some of it, so what's driving that lower per cow production and therefore lower per hectare production, given that we've got the same amount of fertiliser, nitrogen, and there's some other things happening in that low impact fodder beet system. So what does that equate through to in terms of cumulative milk solids production. So for the standard system, so similar, so 1245 kilograms of milk solids per hectare for the standard kale and 1220 for the fodder beet. So we had the fodder beet started off well and we were pretty excited about that, but then at the tail end of the season the kales took over. The lower impact kale system at just over 1,000 a hectare, and our lower impact fodder beet at 960. So yeah, this differential in our low impact system is something that we really want to try and tease and to delve into and see what minor changes we can potentially be making in terms of rotation length and things, getting I guess our pasture quality. Is there things that we need to be doing differently around the management to try and lift this or minimise this gap in here going forward? Because as Louise has pointed out with the wagon wheel, we've got some real advantages with our lower impact fodder beet system from an environmental perspective, but we need to get the profitability of that system up, and we'll talk about that shortly. So I'm handing back to Louise and she'll just go through the last couple of slides.
So the reproduction stuff's really interesting. So again, we had the faster calving spread in the fodder beets in this past season and in the standard, both the cow beets actually, which is a function of the reproductive performance the season before. So we had better reproductive performance in the fodder beets year one. We've had a real turnaround that year too. So despite having a slower calving spread over here in these herds, they've actually had the better reproductive performance for the year. So the pinks, the standard cows, had the worst calving spread. They had the lowest body condition score at calving, and they had the most cows that we were actively managing throughout the season. That meant that we rolled into AB and we had 70 of 200 of these on once a day pre-mating because they hadn't cycled, and we had the data to show they'd either had a BCS issue at calving and they weren't in great condition now, or they'd been okay at calving but they were in suboptimal condition now, and or they'd had a health event of hard calving, which there are an awful lot of, a year with big calves and the cows having bigger calves than the fodder beets, it hit them even harder, or a metabolic event or a lameness event or a mastitis. So we intervened, used the same rules for everybody, but we had to intervene hardest on this herd. So it was really interesting that starting with the slower spread and the lower BCS, just good old once a day being the only band-aid we could really apply, we actually had a really good result out of these cows. So that's kind of the cows. The fodder beets arguably had the right BCS and they had the advantage of calving spread, but we really saw a difference. So our intervention looks comparable and our submission rates look comparable, but when you get into the 6 week and calf rate, we start to see a real difference. So the standards were yes, Nicole, I have 2 minutes left. This is your 2-minute warning. The in-calf rates were starting to separate a wee bit here, with the standards being slightly better than the low impacts, which is really interesting. But when it came around to the empty rate at scanning, we saw a big differential, and we didn't see for quite similar 6 week in calf rates that we have an empty rate split like this. So we had the same amount of bull power out in the herd, and the bulls were swapping between herds as they'd take breaks and bits and pieces. So we don't think it was necessarily a bull. And really important to talk about this one, our not in calf rate. So that includes the cows that disappeared prior to scanning. So we had a few, especially in the low impact fodder beets, because they've got the biggest jump. A couple of udders and feet and things that just weren't going to make it, that disappeared over the kind of Christmas New Year period, who some of them we knew their reproductive status and we knew that they were likely not in calf, which is why we got rid of them earlier rather than later. So that not in calf rate is really important. So yeah, a bit of a standout run here from the herd that started on the back foot. So we'll see what happens this year. And then probably the most interesting thing for me to play with, because I like my numbers, the profit between them at the end of the day. So the blue bars show you the revenue for the farmlet gross. So, 580,000 for the standard fodder beets, 581,000 for the standard kales, and 463,000 for the low impact fodder beets, 500,000. So we've got $100,000 swing in total revenue coming to the farmlet. But you've got a matching reduction in operating costs of these farmlets. So less money in, but less money out. When you boil it down to the profit, so standard cows are our reference point. So they were 170,000 profit for the year. Standard fodder beat's 163. So that's, you know, rounding area, that's a photo finish at the gates. Our low impact fodder beat, however, at 108,000, that's that profit differential we're talking about. So for effectively a 200 or 170 cow farm, we've got a $60,000 profit difference. Whereas when we look at the calves, the profit difference sitting around that 18,000, so far less of a profit impact because of the cost savings. So like Dawn said, we have to find out what's going on with Team Yellow, low impact fodder beats. This year the game is we've got to get them cracking over 1,000 milk solids a hectare and see what we can fine tune to get our way there. But a critical piece of the puzzle, but like we keep referring back to, the story around profit and farm systems researchers, we've got to compare all of it. And this little farm down here is doing the world's good work on nutrient loss to waterways. So if we can tweak it and improve the profitability, we find an amazing recipe for farmers. Okay, Nicole, I'm done.
So handing over
handing over to Ross.
Yeah.
And Ross will tell me when to change a slide.
Thanks, Louise. So this is the summary information from the first 2 years of drainage measurement. And those autumn treatments I referred to earlier are shown on the left in the light blue bars. Not surprisingly, we're losing 100 kilos of N per hectare per year in the grazed autumn treatment. Bare soil, there's no sink for that nitrogen that's left around. When Chris did the soil measurements, we consistently find somewhere between sort of 50 and 80 kilos of N per hectare sitting there at that autumn grazing time. So there's a bit of residual nitrogen that's susceptible to loss as the winter rains arrive. The surprise was that lifting didn't make much of a difference. It's virtually the same. And my best guess is that, well, perhaps we shouldn't have expected such an effect, given that there's quite a bit of nitrogen that seems to be lying around even before grazing. And also the grazing is quite a quick 90-minute duration, so the cows aren't actually adding a lot of urinary nitrogen. The next set of bars is comparing the grazed fodder beet in dark blue there with the kale for the winter grazing events, and this is quite a marked difference. The losses from grazing on the fodder beet crop are about half of those per hectare losses from kale, which we'll see in the next slide when we get there, adds up to quite a significant reduction for that farmlet. And then finally, that bar out to the right, we're losing about 20 to 25 units of N from the pastures. There's quite a bit of rubber in those measurements between the different paddocks, which is always something that bedevils us trying to get good tight numbers, but they're about ballpark and similar to what Overseer is predicting. So if I could have the next slide, please, Louise. So this is a wash up of the results thus far. On average, we're losing about 120 kilos of N per hectare in the kale, about half of that per hectare in the fodder beet. Chris and I thought that this metric of calculating kilograms of N leached per cow wintered was perhaps the best way of accounting for the fact that there are different crop area required for fodder beet versus kale. As you would expect, you would need less area of the fodder beet. When we do the numbers for that kilos of N leached per cow wintered, what we're looking at is about a 60% reduction for the fodder beets. So that's quite a large and surprising effect, which will be important that we, if it holds true for year 3 as well, that'll be quite useful data for upgrading some of our nutrient loss models, such as overseer. That might be it from me, is it, Louise?
So, yep. And so, yeah, like it's a really important piece of the puzzle to understand this environmental footprint of the farmland. So it's great to have this work being done by ag research. And so, you know, looking at what's going on underneath the crops as a subsection of the total performance of the farmland, it's fantastic to have that real information being generated for farmers.